Hey, Steven is currently away on holiday and he's asked me to help out making sure you guys get your Reddit stories. So let's get into them. What I did to my deceitful stepbrother. I sat, pensive, on the edge of a brown bench ruminating on my recent actions. I'd never been one to take justice into my own hands, but after what Luke did to me, I had to make sure he got what he deserved. And like all siblings, we never totally got along. It's not like we hated each other, there was just always something to fight about. Arguments over who got to use the bathroom we shared first, fight over the last bottle of cherry cola in the freezer, and tantrums over whose turn it was to wash the plates that lay in the sink. Nothing unforgivable, just little spats here and there. Occasionally, we did see eye to eye on some subjects, like the time I fought with a bunch of our middle school classmates for making fun of his haircut, or when we joined forces to steal the box of strawberry Pop-Tarts that our parents had tried to hide from us, or when we were on the same football team. We had balance. We weren't too sweet on each other, neither were we too savage. But his mum didn't agree with that. She wanted us to be best friends, but that was impossible. My real mother had died when I was very little. I could never recall what she looked or smelled like. Luke's father had left immediately after he figured out that Luke was on his way into the world, so our parents had married Luke's father had left immediately after he figured out that Luke was on his way into the world, so our parents had married each other to try and raise us in a home as normal and as loving as possible. We weren't even allowed to call each other step-siblings. Our whole childhood was spent pretending to be well behaved at one social event or the other, vacation trip to the Bahamas, and posing for a million family portraits. To everyone on the outside, we looked like a big perfect family. The weird thing was that our parents had brainwashed themselves enough to believe that we were perfect, and they put a highly ridiculous amount of pressure on us to maintain that reputation. The pressure was raised to its climax when we got into high school. With the ultimate college decisions coming to the end of our high school years, we had a lot of work to do so we could make it into Ivy's, the most reputable school. We had to ensure we got almost perfect grades in all our subjects, took on advanced placements classes, participated in more than a few clubs and sports, and stayed on the good side of all the teachers who were known for writing exemplary recommendations. There was no time when we were scolded for being less than satisfactory, but I believe being shouted at would have been less painful than the disappointed frowns or murmurs of "you can do better" we received. And it was even more painful when you received those gestures while your sibling was being praised. So not only were we warring with ourselves to do the best we could, but there was also a silent competition brewing between us. At first, I wasn't conscious of this competition, but it became obvious to me one evening while we were waiting for our parents to get home, so they'd tell us how we'd done in our class reports. It was officially mailed to them. Luke and I were both seated at the dining table, eating our dinners in silence. "You think you'll still maintain your 5.0 GPA after this term?" he'd asked me out of nowhere. I shrugged. Wouldn't be surprised if I did. You think all your AP classes would boost you up to that? Immediately after I'd asked that question, I instantly regretted it. He looked wounded, like I'd struck a wound he'd been nursing. He didn't quite say anything to me for the rest of the night, but I saw the look he gave me when it was confirmed that I hadn't messed up my GPA. It was pure envy, an emotion that I'd come to understand too. I thought he'd decided he'd had enough of struggling to catch up with me that night. My grades had always been slightly better than his, because soon afterwards, he switched tactics. He started to focus more on his sports. Luke was built like an athlete. He had long legs for running, the height of a basketballer, and enough agility for just about any sport. It wasn't long before he became Coach Xander's star football player, and his grades changed to student-athlete grades. Having student-athlete grades meant that a percentage of his GPA was made up of how well he did as an athlete, while the other was made up of his actual school grades. Because he wasn't a bad student, but he was an even better athlete, I was soon the one struggling to keep up with him. I exaggerate. He wasn't permanently getting better grades than I was, he was just looking at better college chances than I was. If he got into an Ivy and I didn't, I'd never be able to live it down. My fears were heightened when he got scouted by a D1 agent. I started to take all the extracurricular activities I could to make me more competitive. It suddenly wasn't just about my brother. A million other highly gifted children would be sending in their applications when I sent mine that fall. What would set me apart? I needed to stand out, but I didn't have any other special gifts in sports or arts, so I signed up for community service. But I wasn't comfortable yet. I needed a big break, but I wasn't sure what I was looking for till it hit me in the face. Literally. I was walking to my 5th class of the day when a piece of crumpled paper smacked my nose. I looked up and saw a bunch of jocks having fun tearing up some things from the notice board and throwing them at each other. I straightened out the piece of paper to see what they'd thrown at me, and suddenly it felt like gold in my hands. It was an advertisement for a competition. Some philanthropic organization was looking to select a teenager who'd dream up a project that would solve some national or close to the national scale problem. And they were ready to fund the cause as long as it spoke to them. Applicants were expected to submit and present their propositions at the park next week. They were going to pick the best 3 ideas, and the teenagers of the news on social media and check the latest newspapers and gossip columns were going to be given a free hand to execute their ideas. How exciting was that? I wasn't about to mess with that opportunity. The next day, I started on a survey. I questioned all the people I considered wise or at least knowledgeable about the world on what they thought the biggest issue in the nation was presently, and I noted them down. Then I started my research. I watched reruns. I narrowed down the lists and decided on the problem I wanted to solve. Then came the hard part. I wrote draft upon draft on the solutions that I'd like to make, but none of them were any good. I was almost in over my head with thinking. I need to make progress with the solution so I could start to work on my presentation, and I had very limited time left. I dozed off on my desk when I heard a knock on the door. Luke walked into my room with a tray in his hands. "Mum said I should bring you lunch," he said. "Thanks." "May I ask what kept you in here all day?" he asked. "I'm working on a project to fix a national issue," I sighed. "Well, I was working on it." He shook his head. "I knew that. Just wanted you to say it out loud, so you'll see how ridiculous it sounds." I rolled my eyes at him. "Well, let me see how far you've gone," he said. "I may just be able to help you." He began to look through my files and the things I'd written down. For someone whose head got hit by a ball often, he had pretty solid advice to give me. Before I knew it, with his help, I'd fully drafted out the problem I wanted to fix and its solution, and I had more than enough time to prepare my presentation. The night before I was to present to the judges, Luke came to cheer me on. "Hey bro," he'd said. "I know we don't get along so well, but I'm here to tell you not to be worried about how tomorrow goes down. With or without this, you have one of the most amazing credentials I've ever seen. Good luck out there." I was so touched by this sudden show of love. I wanted to hug him and thank him for caring about me, but I held myself back. Little did I know that he was trying to pass a different message under the words he'd said. But it wasn't my fault that I hadn't noticed that he looked guilty or nervous as he spoke. I had my mind on more important things, like how the next day would play out. The day finally came, and I was jittery, full of nerves. I couldn't even eat that morning because I feared I'd lose my breakfast all over the stage. I wasn't particularly shy and I didn't normally have stage fright, but this was such a massive game changer that I couldn't control all the butterflies fluttering in my stomach. I waited back a bit for all the other applicants to register their names so I would make my presentation a little later in the day. I saw Luke from a distance and waved at him. He'd probably come to cheer me on. The noise from the speakers made my head buzz, so I decided to move a little distance from the event where I could breathe in fresh air and utter a few prayers. It wasn't going to be a problem since I'd been notified that it wouldn't be my turn for almost 2 hours. I'd managed to get my nerves under control and my 2 hours were almost up, so I began walking back to the tents that had been set up for applicants. I hadn't even reached the gathering when I started to catch suspiciously familiar phrases. I wasn't sure at first where I'd heard them. I started to hear facts and figures that I knew by heart. How did I know all that? I wondered. Then it hit me. I'd heard them from me. I'd been repeating those same words every day for 4 days now. What sort of coincidence was going on? I looked up to the stage and saw Luke flashing the judges sugary sweet smiles just as he was reading out my conclusion. The world would be a much better place if we cared more about the future, and these children are the future of tomorrow. We either take these orphans in and help raise them, or leave them to fend for themselves and risk them turning to vices. The choice is ours. The applause was deafening, and even after it ended, my ears kept ringing. Our eyes met as he descended the stage and shot me an apologetic look. I couldn't believe it. I should have snapped out of it, but I couldn't. Unfortunately for me, I was the next person called up to the stage. As if led by some invisible force, I was drawn onto the stage. I held the microphone between my hands and stared at the crowd. I had no presentation. It had been stolen. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I apologized and ran off the stage. I was thoroughly embarrassed and disappointed. I couldn't believe that Luke would do that to me. That must have been his plan from the beginning, and he did well to mask his real intentions. "How could you do that to me?" I'd asked him. He responded that he was desperate. Well, I was desperate now, desperate to make him pay for making a fool of me and for stealing all my hard work. A month later, he was awarded second place and was to begin hosting meetings with the rest of his team. I felt like someone had rubbed salt on my open wound. It was so heartbreaking to watch him usurp something I'd worked so hard for. but I didn't let a single tear go to waste. He was going to feel exactly what I felt very soon. I allowed him to take all the glory for being a sports star, and now for being a genius humanitarian. I watched him swell with pride, forgetting that he'd robbed me to wear the crown he now donned. I was quietly waiting for the end of the football season. As it got closer, I started getting my plan ready. The final game of the season was the most important of them all. Luke was permanently coming home late at night after being trained sore by Coach Xander. All the football athletes were excused from non-credit classes to get more rest or extra training hours. They were even getting much nicer and healthier school lunches than the rest of us to build their protein. How unfair. As the day of the final match drew nearer, I volunteered to help out in the locker room. Luke must have underestimated me because he didn't look twice when he started to see me in the locker room. Maybe he didn't suspect a thing. Maybe he thought he'd catch me if I tried to do anything. Whatever the reason, he let me be. Sometimes I happened to walk past the team training ruthlessly or Coach Xander motivating them, and I felt a teeny tiny bit bad that I was going to make all these innocent people suffer for the sins of one person. But I couldn't stop. The only way I was going to get over the whole incident was when I saw Luke in pain. So I did what I had to do. Being in the locker room gave me access to the tactic their team planned to use. Luke was their star player, and they were going to ensure he sat and refreshed himself at halftime while they finalised their tactics, so he would have a lot of strength to play his best toward the end of the game. That was my cue. While the game was going on, I snuck in and stole his water bottle. I poured some oral steroids into his bottle and sat back to watch the event unfold. As expected, after he'd had a drink of his water, he was pumped and played the field like a maniac. As he made the final goal, everyone was at the edge of their seats, silent and hopeful. When it sailed through the net, shouts of his name filled the air. Our school won the game by a wide margin, and you could feel the excitement alive in the air. The team roared and hugged each other, carrying Luke on their shoulders, but their celebration was interrupted. The referee announced with a solid frown that all the players were getting tested for drugs before the winners would be declared. I'd left him an anonymous clue. The athletes complained that it made no sense, but there was no resistance from anyone. At least they weren't bothered that they'd have to wait for days because our urinalysis gave instant results. The whole school murmured in confusion as we waited for the outcome of the tests. Coach Xander was furious that the referee had insisted on the test and had tried to argue it out, but the referee wouldn't budge. The look on Coach Xander's face when he saw the test result was disappointment. He looked at Luke, who didn't understand what was going on, and told him to meet him in his office after he left the field. The referee gave instructions to the commentators, who announced that the trophy wouldn't be given to any of the teams because a player from the winning team had been found guilty of taking performance-enhancing drugs. Immediately after the announcement was made, Luke turned to stare at me, wide-eyed. He knew what I'd done. I shrugged and looked away. He started to scream that it was unfair and that he'd never taken drugs to boost his performance. He specifically said he'd been set up and he knew who'd done it. At that point, I started to feel a bit scared, but the referee warned him to keep his mouth shut if he didn't have any evidence or the situation would be escalated. Initially, his identity was kept a secret from the rest of the school, but someone found a copy of the urinalysis results and the whole school was heavy with gossip about Luke. At that point, he knew there was no way to clear his name without causing more trouble for himself, so he removed his things from the locker room like he was asked to. He was officially no longer part of the school's football team. I innocently went into the locker room to get some and happened to walk past Luke clearing out his locker. He turned to look at me with bitter tears falling from his eyes. "You did this," he said, his voice sounding tired and defeated. I smiled at him and walked away, not a single drop of guilt in my heart. That was the best 2 minutes of my life. Well, I mean, he went for your studies, you went for his sports. That seems fair, right, guys? I mean, both of these people sound completely unhinged, to be totally honest. Like, seriously? You're gonna steal from your own brother and take months of his work, and then your brother, in response, is gonna drug you at the middle of a game so you perform well and submit a tip? I mean, he could have just, like, put laxatives in there or something. That would have just been embarrassing. Yeah, both of these guys suck. This next story is No One Messes With My Mum and Gets Away With It. The year was 2011. I was still young at the time, probably around 14, about to turn 15, I guess, so I can't really remember much from back then. But there was one thing that would forever remain ingrained in my mind at the time, which was the fact that my father had died during his time of service to our country. My dad was deployed to one of the most unsettled parts of the country. Relative to how risky being in a place like that was to the amount of financial returns and generational recognition, my dad still decided to head out for his service. The news came to my mother through a messenger from the army. He was apparently my father's best friend while he was in service. Out of all the different emotions that were flying that afternoon, the one that resonated the most was that of my mother. No matter how young I was at the time, I could still figure out at the time that mother was in the worst place she could possibly be. It was not until next week that every single member of the family decided to pay their respects to my mother and myself. While they were paying their respects, I just stood there, staring at an empty space. Most times I'd get lost staring, and I would get called back by other people in the room. At this point, I was just feeling neutral. I was neither happy, nor sad, nor depressed, nor angry. I was just neutral, and there was nothing I could have done. Things around the house were very much different for quite a while. My mother was at the point where I began to get scared as to whether or not she's willing to live and take care of me, because at the time, I felt as there was nothing for me to live for anymore. She would just try to end her life when things had become too much for her, but after much talking with my mother, she decided to make an effort at restoring her life to normal and making sure that things were okay, to say the least. After the passing of my dear father, Mum became a lost soul. She wouldn't leave the house for days, and even when she did, she never stayed outside for more than an hour at most, which was when she wanted to get some things at the supermarket, and thus was on occasions. I had actually thought at the time that things were never going to be the same in our family again, because following the passing of my father, my mother became so isolated that she forgot about heading out to work and all that, to the point where she got several notices from her workplace telling her that she had taken enough time off and if she doesn't resume back, she would be cut off. She had received several notes like this, but she did not respond to any of them. This was the true definition of all-time low. A few weeks had gone by. We were just a month away from being homeless, and we had already run out of money to keep paying for the house. My mum paid her lunar visit to the market to get one or two things from there, and that was where something I had never thought would happen. It was still a normal Tuesday morning. I still had not gone to school since my dad died, as I had always been at home taking care of my mum. And then she came out of her room, improperly dressed, saying that she wanted to head to the market to get a thing or two that we can use to make some dinner and probably breakfast the next day, as she said the money with her was her last. After seeing how homeless my mother looked at the time, I couldn't take it anymore. I quickly tried to tidy her up. As she stood there, immediately I was done. She left, but she was still looking like she could pass out at any time, so I decided to follow her on her way to the supermarket. When we got there, I took a trolley and followed behind her. On the aisle, we were going to pick out some stuffs we stumbled upon. This gentleman, at the time, who saw how depressed my mother was and tried to ignite a conversation between themselves, but my mum still had her dead eyes and she was not even ready to speak to anybody. So I tried to speak on her behalf and asked the gentleman what he wanted. To my surprise, he just said that he saw my mum was in a very down state and he wanted to know why that was and if there was anything he could do. While my mother decided to walk away, I just spoke to the gentleman about what had happened a little bit over a month ago at the time, what we were going through. He was shocked. Since we walked all the way from home, he decided to buy some other things for us and then take both my mum and I back home. I was taken aback by the kindness of this man. When he dropped us off, I had noticed Mum's slight change in facial expression, as throughout the entire journey home, he kept on trying his possible best to make my mum feel alive again. She was unresponsive until we got very close to our house. This was when he said something. I don't think I can remember what he said now, and my mother let out a chuckle. He quickly turned to me and let out a large grin. Deep down, I was happy my mum was going through a change I'd never thought possible. When he dropped us off, I had a thought, but I mistakenly let my thoughts out and said, "Why don't you get her number?" I don't know why I did that, but that was the next thing that came out of my mouth at the time. The look on my mum's face was one I had missed in a very long time. The look of anger. I was scared and happy at the same time. A mixed feelings moment, if you will. After a few moments, he let out his phone and asked for my mum's number and told her to call him if there was anything she needed. She felt reluctant at first, but later on she gave in and released her number. A week later, he called and asked how much our rent would be for the coming month, as I had also told him about that. My mum wasn't awake at the time, so I picked up the phone and spoke with him. At the time, I didn't know what exactly we were paying for the rent, but what I did know was where the bills were kept. So I did a quick search and told him that we would be paying. And once he got that, he said he was going to come and see my mother that evening. I just thanked him and he hung up. Then, that evening, when he came gave my mother the money to take care of herself and also for the rent for the next month. My mum burst out tears as she asked why he was doing all of this. He just told her that he felt like she could use some help after hearing her story from me. She thanked him and she was moved to tears. Thus was the first time since she heard the news about Dad's death that I had seen her cry. I myself also began to tear up a bit. Following the events of that day, Mr. Jim would come over on several occasions over the past few months, sometimes just to hang out with Mum and I, and on some other times, which was later on and about a few months later or thereabout, he would sleep over for the first time. After a few months of meeting Mr. Sampson, apparently that was his name, my mum had gone through significant changes that I had thought at one point would never come. I was happy that things were finally working well for us, especially my mum. After a while, the matter of my school came up in conversation over dinner one fateful evening. And as my mum at the time was still trying to find her balance in life again, Mr. Sampson spoke to me and asked when was the last time I had gone to school or seen my friends, and also what grade I was in before I stopped. I told him that it's been well over 6 months since I've gone to school, and that I was in high school. Once he knew that, he just told me not to worry anymore about whether or not I would go to school again. I smiled as I thanked him. I never knew he was going to ask that fast, as it was not up to 2 days again when he came home to visit my mum and check on the both of us as usual. He broke the news to me that I can now go back and resume school again. This was the first joyous moment I had experienced following the passing of my father. This was exciting, as finally I was getting to go back to school, as I had not been able to go for the last month. I resumed as planned, and school was not what I was expecting. After missing 2 whole terms, I was seriously lagging behind, but this would not stop me, as I was ready and determined to make my mum proud of me. And also, at the time, I wanted to show off how good I could be to Mr. Sampson, as I thought of him as a member of our family at the time already. I quickly got adjusted to school life, and after over a year, I had finally finished my high school, and I was applying for college at the time. At this time, Mr. Sampson was practically already living in our home 5 days and sometimes 6 days in a week. He became someone that was present almost every time. It was nice to have someone around, someone who was willing to stay all day every day. I was so happy for my mum. She had finally found someone she could rely on, and this was a good thing, as quite a while had passed since my dad had passed away, and this seemed like a good opportunity to move on. Apparently, Mr. Sampson had been trying to get my mum to open up to him for quite a while, but she still had some bottled up feelings that she would rather take with her till the moment of her passing than speak out loud. After much convincing on his path and on mine, she finally decided to open up, just a little bit, over dinner. While she was talking, I was moved to tears, as I felt like there was no need for her to keep all these things she was telling us at the time bottled up inside. Mr. Sampson stopped her and gave her a big, warm and comforting hug. I was glad my mum now had someone in her life. This was a very nice feeling, at least at the time. While I was processing my college application, they both came into my room and broke the good news to me, which was that in a few weeks' time, they were getting engaged. I did not know how to feel at the time, but after seeing how greatly he'd changed my mom and how happy he made her, I just thought to myself that if he truly makes her feel happy and complete, then I had no objection, so long as he does not make her revert back to how things were back then. This was the start of our new family, but unfortunately, I wouldn't be here for long to experience my mom on her new journey in life in this marriage. This was because I had already gotten a letter of acceptance from my college of choice a month after I had applied. This was really great news after the other, as I felt like everything going my way was just too good to be true. I thought so for quite a while, but after nothing else happened, I decided to just live in the moment. I wasn't there when my mum and Sampson got married, as I was in school at the time and I was in my exam period, but immediately I was done with the semester. I came back home immediately when we were done with the semester, as I missed my mum so bad, and I also wanted to see how things were with mum and her husband. First off, when I came home, I noticed some changes in the house. There were some new furnitures. Apparently where my dad's picture was in the house was changed, and my mum's new wedding photo was hung up in place of it, and basically everything that belonged to my dad was no longer in the house. I felt bad, really bad, when I first noticed this, but I decided it was at least time to put away Dad's things, as it would bring nothing but bad memories for my mum. So I went along with what they had done with my dad's things. During my first visit back home, I noticed how happy and gleeful my mum was. She was looking vibrant, filled with life and hope. Finally, my old mum was back. Unfortunately, I couldn't stay at home for long as the new semester was resuming quite early and I had to leave earlier than expected. But I did not leave as ordered by the school. We went on family trips and Samson also took me on trips, just the two of us. I had gone back to school the following week as the deadline for resumption was already passed and I was already missing out on classes that was going on in school. After I had gone back to school, I received some terrible news later on that week. I received some terrible news from back home. Apparently Samson got laid off at his place of work due to the company who he was working for getting sold out, and the owner was moving the base of operations overseas. This really was one of those times I had this feeling that once things started to go wrong, it would not stop at just one thing going wrong, but other things would no sooner join suit. I called home most times, but I couldn't go home at the time, mainly because the semester was still in session. But when I finally had the chance to go back home, what I went back home led me to do one of the only things I had ever done in my life to protect my mum. When I got home, I found out that my mum's once gleeful and joyous smile had gone, and I noticed how hard she was trying to get me to believe that everything was alright, which I knew wasn't the case. Later on, after much questioning from me geared towards my mother, I couldn't get anything from her at first. I had to find out by myself what it was my mother was secretly and desperately trying to hide from me. To my greatest surprise, I found out from my neighbours that after Samson had finished his job, he usually drinks, and when he gets back, he would resort to turning my own mother into a punching bag. This had happened more times than my neighbours could count. I was furious. After the passing of my father, I had said to myself to always be there for my mum, and I had initially thought I would not need to worry myself again about the promise I made to myself, as there was already someone in my mum's life to take care of her every need and all. Only for me to come home and found out that he had already turned my mother into his personal punching bag. I thought intensely, day and night, as to what I could do to make him regret ever touching my mother, and I finally came to a conclusion. On this day, I had told both my mum and Samson that I was planning on heading back to school and that it would take a while before I would get back. I left as usual, but this time not for school. Rather, I stayed over at my neighbour's place, waiting patiently for what I had heard happen to my mother whenever he comes home drunk to happen so that I may execute my plan. We waited for quite a while, and when he came back as planned, he went to action and began beating my mother with any object he could find around him. I immediately called the police and reported a case of physical abuse and sexual assault. While the police were on their way, I sprung into action, trying to separate him from beating my mum to a pulp, but in the process of doing so, I also received some beatings in place of my mum. Before he could go any further, the police arrived and restrained him. The ambulance that came over tried to ensure that we had not sustained any serious injuries. While the officers took our statements, I explained everything that had been happening when I was around and during my time away. After fully getting our statements, they took him away. This was the last I ever saw of him. The next time I heard of him was when my mum told me that he was to serve a prison sentence. I don't know for how long, as I had no intention of knowing how long at the time, as this didn't faze me, as it was what was intended from the start. No one would mess with my mother and get away with it. No one. Absolutely no one. Well, I suppose in a situation like that, that's the only thing you really can do. It's good that OP was there for their mother. I'm sure that without a child like that, losing their father would have been a much worse ordeal, and I hope that OP and their mother have found the peace that they deserve. That's all the time we have for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed these stories, and if you want more Nuclear Revenge stories, check out this video. Other than that, I will see you next time.